something unusual is happening in Nigeria. Across markets and offices from Lagos to Kano, a quiet frustration is building. It's not about inflation this time, or even fuel prices. It's about taxes. New laws that many citizens say feel less like reform and more like punishment. Small traders are shutting their doors. Tech startups are reconsidering their future. Even foreign investors are beginning to look elsewhere. What exactly is going on? Why has Nigeria's government launched one of the most aggressive tax overhauls in its history? And what does it really mean for the nation's economy and the people trying to survive within it? In the past few years, Nigeria has faced one of the most turbulent economic landscapes in its modern history. With oil revenues declining, debt obligations rising, and inflation climbing to multi-decade highs, the government has been desperate to find new ways to raise money. But the latest approach, a sweeping expansion of tax laws, has triggered shockwaves across the country. For many Nigerians, the changes represent a direct attack on an already struggling population. For the government, however, these laws are part of a larger plan to restore fiscal stability. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. To understand the story, one must first grasp the depth of Nigeria's financial crisis. Despite being Africa's largest economy and one of the world's top oil producers, Nigeria's government revenue per capita is among the lowest globally. This paradox is rooted in decades of over-reliance on crude oil combined with weak tax enforcement, corruption, and a massive informal sector that largely operates outside the government's reach. As global oil prices became unpredictable and production faltered due to theft and sabotage, Nigeria's budget began to crumble. The response came in the form of the Finance Act and a series of new directives under the administration of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu. These laws introduced taxes and levies that cut across nearly every layer of the economy. For example, the government expanded the value-added tax, VAT, from 5% to 7.5%, a move that affected everything from consumer goods to online transactions. What seemed like a minor percentage increase quickly translated into a heavy burden for millions of Nigerians living on razor-thin margins. Beyond VAT, other taxes and levies appeared almost overnight. A digital services tax now targets online businesses, influencers, and freelancers. A new excise duty affects telecommunications services, meaning phone calls and data usage now come with an extra cost. Even logistics companies and ride-hailing drivers are being taxed under road use and vehicle licensing schemes that many say are excessive and confusing. To make matters worse, the Nigerian Customs Service has been restructured to squeeze higher import duties out of goods entering the country. Businesses importing machinery, electronics, and even basic food items now face increased costs, which inevitably get passed on to consumers. The ripple effect is clear. Prices rise, purchasing power falls, and public frustration deepens. Critics argue that the government's tax reforms are being implemented without proper consultation or consideration for Nigeria's economic realities. With unemployment hovering around 33% and inflation surpassing 30% in food prices, many view these taxes as tone-deaf. "You cannot tax poverty," said one Lagos market trader, echoing a growing sentiment across the country. For small business owners, compliance itself has become a nightmare. In Nigeria's bustling informal economy, estimated to make up over 60% of the country's GDP, most traders and artisans operate without formal registration. Many of them are now being pressured to register with the Corporate Affairs Commission and obtain tax identification numbers, TINs, to continue their operations legally. On paper, it's an effort to broaden the tax base, but on the ground it feels like an attack on survival. "They come to our shops asking for papers we don't understand," said a shopkeeper in Abuja. "We barely make enough to eat, and now they want tax from us." But from the government's perspective, this tax expansion is long overdue. Officials point out that Nigeria's tax-to-GDP ratio, around 10%, is among the lowest in the world. For comparison, South Africa stands at about 27%, while Ghana's is around 14%. Nigeria simply doesn't collect enough taxes to fund public infrastructure, health care, or education. The finance ministry argues that the only way to escape the debt trap and reduce dependence on external loans is to build a sustainable domestic revenue base. However, the problem isn't just the number of taxes, it's the manner of their implementation. Many new levies have been introduced without adequate digital systems or transparency mechanisms. This creates fertile ground for corruption and multiple taxation, where different agencies collect overlapping fees from the same businesses. A transport company, for instance, might pay taxes to federal, state, and local authorities, all for the same vehicle. These overlapping demands create confusion and open doors for bribery, making the system both inefficient and unjust. Meanwhile, multinational corporations operating in Nigeria are watching cautiously. The new laws impose stricter compliance requirements and the transfer pricing audits, making it harder for foreign companies to navigate without legal complications. While the intent is to prevent tax evasion, the fear is that Nigeria's already challenging business environment will become even less attractive to investors. The World Bank's Ease of Doing Business ranking has long reflected Nigeria's bureaucratic hurdles, and now, with additional taxes, investors see even more red tape. One of the most controversial elements of Nigeria's new tax framework is the introduction of green taxes, levies supposedly aimed at environmental sustainability, such as taxes on single-use plastics and carbon-emitting industries. While the concept is globally supported, Nigeria's execution raises eyebrows. Many see it as a way to extract more money rather than a genuine environmental reform. Manufacturers claim they're being punished without any real recycling infrastructure or green incentives in place. The social impact of these tax reforms has been profound. Street protests have erupted in several cities, led by trade unions and youth groups who argue that the burden falls on the poor, while the political elite remain untouched. On social media, hashtags like Stop Multiple Taxation and Tax Madness trend periodically, capturing public outrage. Civil society organizations accuse the government of prioritizing revenue over welfare, pointing out that hospitals and schools remain underfunded even as taxes rise. In response, the government insists that reforms will take time to yield visible results. Officials argue that the short-term pain will lead to long-term stability, pointing to countries like Rwanda and Kenya that successfully broadened their tax bases before achieving economic takeoff. Yet, Nigeria's unique challenge lies in trust, or rather, the lack of it. Decades of corruption and wasteful spending have eroded citizens' confidence that their taxes will ever be used properly. Without visible improvement in public services, taxpayers see no reason to comply willingly. The administration's Revenue Mobilization and Fiscal Policy Committee has attempted to modernize collection by integrating digital payment systems. They claim these systems will reduce leakages and ensure that every naira collected goes directly into government coffers. However, in practice, the rollout has been uneven, especially in rural areas where digital infrastructure remains weak. Many small businesses operate offline, making electronic compliance nearly impossible. For everyday Nigerians, the effect is simple but devastating. Transport fares go up, electricity bills rise, food becomes more expensive. Every new tax, even if small in percentage, adds up to a heavier burden on an already strained population. The informal sector, once a refuge from bureaucratic pressure, is now being dragged into the net. This has led some citizens to turn away from formal trade altogether, deepening the shadow economy that the government is trying to formalize. There's also a psychological component at play. The sense that citizens are being milked while politicians continue to live lavishly has created a dangerous disconnect. Reports of lawmakers receiving huge allowances and new luxury vehicles undermine the moral justification for new taxes. The government's narrative of shared sacrifice rings hollow when ordinary Nigerians see little evidence of equality in hardship. As the reforms continue, economists are divided. Some argue that Nigeria has no choice but to broaden its tax net if it hopes to reduce borrowing and build sustainable public finance. Others warn that overtaxation without corresponding growth will only suffocate the economy. The middle ground, they say, lies in targeted taxation, focusing on wealthier corporations and luxury consumption rather than everyday essentials. International observers are watching closely. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank have long urged Nigeria to boost its non-oil revenue. While they applaud the intent behind the reforms, they also warn that aggressive implementation could lead to social unrest if not paired with welfare support. A few experts even suggest that Nigeria could learn from models in Southeast Asia, where gradual incentive-based tax reforms encourage compliance without triggering economic backlash. At the heart of it all, the Nigerian people remain caught between two realities, the promise of reform and the pain of its execution. As the government tightens its grip on revenue collection, citizens demand accountability. Where will this money go? Will it fund roads, schools, and hospitals, or disappear, as it often has, into the pockets of a few? In the end, Nigeria's new tax laws are not just about economics, they're about trust, governance, and the social contract between state and citizen. They expose a deeper question that every Nigerian must grapple with. Can a nation truly develop when its people no longer believe in the system meant to serve them? The world is watching Africa's largest economy. If Nigeria succeeds in turning taxation into a tool for transformation, it could set an example for the continent. But if it fails, if these new laws push millions further into poverty, the damage could last for generations. And so the question remains, are Nigeria's new tax laws a path toward stability, or the beginning of a fiscal nightmare? Only time will tell. To truly understand the chaos of Nigeria's new tax system, one must look not just at what the laws say, but at why they exist at all. Every tax regime tells a story of power, of dependence, and of a government's relationship with its people. And in Nigeria, that story stretches back over a century, to the era when taxation wasn't just about money, it was about control. Long before Nigeria became the bustling democracy it is today, taxes were used by colonial authorities as a way to enforce obedience. The infamous hut tax of the early 20th century wasn't a tool of development. It was a method to force local communities into the cash economy, to compel men to work in mines and plantations controlled by British companies. Paying tax was never about roads or schools. It was about subservience to a system built far away in London. That legacy never truly disappeared. After independence, the structures remained, a state that collected but rarely delivered. And so, taxation in Nigeria evolved into something different from what most modern citizens expect. It became a kind of uneasy truce. The government would tax, the citizens would resist or evade, and somehow the country would limp along in between bursts of oil wealth. But that uneasy balance has now been shattered. The new laws are more than just fiscal adjustments. They represent a massive shift in the relationship between state and citizen. Across the country, small traders complain that their daily earnings are being sliced apart by levies they can't understand. For many, the government's insistence on taxing informal activities feels like an assault. The corner food seller, the mechanic, the bus driver, they were once left to survive outside the radar of the tax system. Now they find themselves confronted by officials with forms, receipts, and threats of closure. At first, it may seem logical. Nigeria has one of the lowest tax-to-GDP ratios in the world, just around 10%. For comparison, South Africa sits above 25%, and even Kenya's is near 18%. But the question isn't whether Nigerians pay enough tax. It's whether they get enough value in return. A Nigerian citizen looks at the pothole-ridden roads, the constant blackouts, the water shortages, and wonders, where does my money go? When you pay tax in Europe, you get healthcare, education, infrastructure, security. When you pay tax in Nigeria, you often get nothing, and that's the root of the outrage. Because the issue isn't just about tax rates, it's about trust. Economists say taxation works only when there's what they call a social contract. a mutual understanding that what citizens give will be used for their benefit. But that contract in Nigeria is fractured beyond recognition. The citizens do not trust the state, and the state does not trust the citizens. The result? A spiral of evasion, corruption, and inefficiency that keeps repeating itself. Now, the government claims these new taxes are part of a reform effort, an attempt to diversify revenue away from oil, to create a more sustainable economy. In principle, it's a sound idea. Nigeria cannot depend forever on oil revenue, but the execution has been brutal. Take, for instance, the new excise duties on digital services, a tax that affects everything from online streaming to e-commerce. The idea was to bring the booming digital sector into the tax net, but in practice it punishes innovation. A young Nigerian app developer or YouTube creator suddenly finds their profits sliced by taxes they barely understand, while multinational corporations with teams of lawyers find ways around them. Then there's the import levy, another major controversy. Designed to encourage local manufacturing, it has instead made basic goods more expensive. For a nation that relies heavily on imported raw materials, it feels like a penalty for existing in a globalized economy, and the ripple effects are everywhere. In Lagos, a small business owner now pays multiple layers of taxes: federal income tax, state levy, local government fee, environmental fee, and development levies, all while still paying bribes to keep inspectors at bay. In Kano, farmers complain that new land use taxes make it harder to expand production. In Abuja, salaried workers find that after taxes and inflation, their take-home pay can barely sustain them for 2 weeks. This is not reform. It's fiscal suffocation. But perhaps the most dangerous consequence of these new laws is not economic, it's political. When citizens feel exploited rather than supported, the legitimacy of the state begins to erode. You can't build a tax culture on anger and suspicion. The more people feel cheated, the more they retreat into informal systems, barter, cash, or even cryptocurrency. And so, the government ends up chasing shadows. It sends auditors and enforcement teams, imposes fines, blocks bank accounts. Yet the real economy, the lifeblood of Nigeria, starts to disappear underground. This is not unique to Nigeria, of course. Across Africa, countries are under immense pressure from international lenders and institutions to widen their tax base. But what's often forgotten is that Africa's informal sector, street vendors, artisans, small traders, is not a sign of laziness. It's a symptom of systemic failure. People turn informal because the formal system is stacked against them. When taxes become instruments of extraction rather than empowerment, they drive people away. And once trust collapses, rebuilding it takes generations. It's worth remembering that Nigeria's citizens are already paying a kind of shadow tax, not through government, but through survival. They pay private security because public policing fails them. They pay private schools because the education system is broken. They pay for generators and boreholes because the state cannot guarantee electricity or water. When you add it all up, Nigerians are among the most heavily self-taxed populations on earth, yet somehow, the official narrative still insists that citizens aren't paying enough. Perhaps the most tragic irony is that while the poor face stricter enforcement, the wealthy continue to navigate the system with ease. The same companies that make billions from Nigeria's markets often shift profits offshore, using loopholes that even the tax authorities barely understand. And when the government tries to tighten controls, political pressure quickly mounts to reverse them. This imbalance deepens inequality. The taxes that should reduce the gap between rich and poor instead reinforce it. Let's not forget, Nigeria is Africa's largest economy. Its GDP surpasses $400 billion. Its youth population is one of the most entrepreneurial in the world. Yet, the tax debate has turned into a war between citizens and their own government. A war where both sides lose. The solution, however, is not to abolish taxes. It's to redefine them. Nigeria needs taxation not as punishment, but as partnership. The system must become transparent, digitized, and accountable. Every citizen should be able to see where their money goes and what it builds. Imagine, for example, a public online dashboard showing exactly how tax revenues are spent, from road construction in Kaduna to hospital upgrades in Port Harcourt. Imagine if tax collection were simplified, fair, and corruption-free. Trust would begin to grow. Compliance would rise naturally, not through intimidation, but through belief. Some countries have already done this. Rwanda, for instance, built a digital tax collection system that minimized human contact and reduced corruption. Ghana simplified small business taxes with fixed rates that made compliance easy. If Nigeria adopted similar models, the results could be transformative, but that will require courage, political, moral, and intellectual courage. Because true tax reform in Nigeria means confronting powerful interests that thrive in the shadows. As things stand, the new tax laws risk widening the gap between the rulers and the ruled. They threaten to turn a frustrated citizenry into an alienated one, yet there's still time to change course. Nigeria stands at a crossroads between two futures. In one, it becomes a nation where taxation fuels resentment, where citizens view the state as a predator rather than a partner. In the other, it becomes a nation where revenue truly serves the people, where tax is seen not as theft, but as contribution. The path Nigeria chooses will determine not just its economic stability, but its democratic survival. Because taxation, at its core, is about belonging. It's a test of whether a government truly serves its people or merely rules over them. And so the outrage over these new laws is more than economic frustration. It's a cry for dignity, for fairness, for a country that treats its people not as prey, but as partners. The story of Nigeria's taxes, then, is not just about money. It's about identity. It's about a nation learning painfully that you cannot build a prosperous future on a broken foundation. In the end, what Nigeria needs is not another tax. It needs trust.